be screwed, feel my own adrenaline. Yeah, I do just what I do, and I hope you let me in, yeah.
Hello and welcome back, fellow anime lovers, to Cypherfics. I am delighted to have you join us once again in the world of fanfiction and fantasy. This is the fourth part of, What If Harry Potter Meets My Little Pony? Special note, this fanfic is written and a masterpiece of tkepner on fanfiction.net. Do check and support the author too. Now smash the like, share and subscribe button for more. Also press the bell icon so that you never miss such great parts. Thanks for the introduction. Now let's dive into the world. Later that evening, he startled Twilight when she saw him writing with his fetlock grasping the quill. Well, I already know how to write, and my tongue and lips were getting tired, so I decided to try to write with my hoof, he explained. He pointed with his other hoof, this is like the tip of my finger. He pointed at his fetlock joint, and this is my knuckle. He indicated the big bone that was next, this is my palm. And this is my wrist. He pointed much farther up his foreleg. He grinned at her and held up his fetlock-held quill. This is like holding a pen in the palm of my hand instead of with my fingers. He frowned. I don't have nearly as much control as I used to. I have to move my whole arm to write, but it's so much easier than that mouth writing, he concluded. Really? She came over and inspected how he was holding his quill. Books started to fly over and a moment later they were both looking at a drawing of a pony's foreleg and comparing it to a drawing of a dragon's hand. You're right, she said excitedly. You'll have to show this to Cheerilee, this might be a new and better way to write. He stared at his hoof. It would be even easier if I had something I could fit onto my hoof to hold the pen. Then I'd only have to move my hoof instead of my leg. It'd make it much easier and faster. A spoon came flying out of the kitchen. A minute later, with the help of a couple of sticking and bending spells, Harry was writing much better than he had been, and almost as well as he used to in Little Whinging Primary. Harry grinned happily. No more staying after school learning to write all over again. Unfortunately, Harry discovered on the next day, Miss Cheerilee disagreed. While she allowed him to write how he wanted, she insisted he learn how to mouth write, just in case he ever hurt his right foreleg. This afternoon lesson would be the last one, but she did tell him she planned to test him periodically. And have Twilight work with him in the evenings. To Harry's surprise, after finishing practice mouth writing that afternoon, the three fillies were waiting for him. We thought you might like to join us in crusading today, said Sweetie Belle. Yeah, said Apple Bloom, we're almost finished with our siege engine. Cutie Mark Crusaders Mass Destruction Engineers. Why, shouted Scootaloo. Harry stared at the three ponies. Okay, he said slowly. Were they pretending they were ancient warriors or something? Come on, Scootaloo said, turning and heading for a scooter with a small wagon behind it. The other two quickly hurried after her and hopped into the wagon. Harry followed a bit slower, taking steps carefully. So, this was the contraption that they had used to convey him to the hospital. The scooter was surprisingly familiar, just not as tall and much longer than the ones he was familiar with, not unreasonable considering the fillies were longer than they were tall and needed the extra foot space. One leg at a time, he climbed into the wagon, which was barely large enough for the three of them. The other two didn't seem to mind the close quarters at all, so Harry tried to ignore his discomfort at being in close contact with others. And wearing no clothes. Scootaloo gave a solid push with her right rear leg and started flapping her wings at an incredible rate. That, Harry realized, was the odd buzzing sound he had heard that first day. And it was a very easy method for moving the scooter. Much better than periodically pushing with one foot. And allowed faster speeds, as he discovered to his dismay. We're going to my place, Apple Bloom explained as they hurtled through the town at an insane speed for such a small vehicle. That's where we're building the trebuchet. Harry gripped the sides of the wagon tightly as they bounced up, down, left and right, and sometimes on two wheels even though they were going straight. He briefly considered grabbing the wagon side with his mouth for additional safety, but was afraid he might lose a few teeth on the bigger bumps. The ride became progressively worse as they left the road and started across the orchard in Sweet Apple Acres. A few terror-filled minutes later they coasted to a stop beside something Harry had only seen in books. A trebuchet on wheels, a stone-powered catapult with a sling. It had a horizontal rectangular frame, with one set of 3 poles on each side forming the vertical supports, which had to be 12 feet high, at the shortest. They held up the throwing arm, which towered over them by another 12 feet. Attached to the bottom of the arm, barely above the bed of the trebuchet, was a large empty bucket. A rope hung from the top of the arm. Midway down the rope was what looked like a heavy weave section of cloth. The end of the rope dangled into a trough, centered between the supports, which ran the length of the rectangular base. Carved into the side was, "Made by Scootaloo, Sweetie Belle, and Apple Bloom, Cutie Mark Crusaders." Harry slowly walked around the device, staring in disbelief. He turned to the fillies who were at the edge of the path separating the property from the forest. They were filling Scootaloo's wagon with rocks as fast as they could find them. "Where did you get this?" Scootaloo looked up and said, "Come on, help us fill the bucket." Harry walked over to them and half-heartedly picked up a fist-sized rock in his fetlock and dropped it in the wagon. "Where did you get that?" he repeated. "We built it," Apple Bloom said proudly after dropping another rock in the wagon. "And let me tell you the arithmetic on how big to make it was a killer," added Sweetie Belle, adding another rock. Harry just stared at them, speechless. Finally, he said, disbelievingly, "You built it?" "Yep," came the chorus, accompanied by the thuds of 3 more rocks dropping into the wagon. "Took us almost a whole week after school," explained Sweetie Belle as she levitated another rock into the wagon. "It took them the rest of the afternoon to load the trebuchet's bucket using the ladder and their saddlebags. By the end, Harry was levitating rocks the size of his hoof into the wagon, and he was almost exhausted. Then they pulled the throwing rope down until the top of the throwing arm was at bed and the bucket was lifted high. A short rope loop tethered the arm to the trebuchet's bed. The end of the throwing rope had a small loop, which they placed over a pin sticking out of the throwing arm. Now that it was closer, he could see there were 2 ropes, one tied to each end of the sack. They pulled the sack down the length of the trebuchet's trough until the ropes were stretched out almost completely to the opposite end from the pinned throwing arm. It took all 4 of them to roll a small boulder onto the sack. They pulled the sack edges out around it to form a cloth cup. Just like the cup of a slingshot, Harry realized. Finally, Scootaloo ran up to the linchpin holding down the throwing arm. "Okay, fillies. Ready?" She grabbed it in her teeth. Harry tackled her before she could pull it. "No. No. No," he shouted. "Not safe." In a calmer voice, he said, "Let's tie a rope to the pin and pull it out when we're at a safe distance, so if something goes wrong nobody gets hurt." "Okay." Grumbling about unnecessary delays, Apple Bloom ran back to their clubhouse and returned with a coiled rope. Far more than they needed, but that was all right. A few minutes later, the 4 of them stood 30 feet away. Harry felt they were still far too close but he couldn't convince the girls to go any farther away. Scootaloo again said, "Ready? Here goes." She grabbed the rope in her mouth and backed up quickly. The rope went taut and then slack as the pin popped out. It looked like it was moving slow at first as the arms started to swing upright, but the sling moved quickly down the trough in the middle of the bed and then lifted the boulder into the air. They watched the boulder shoot out over the orchard. "It works," shouted Scootaloo. "Wahoo!" shouted Apple Bloom. "Yes," shouted Sweetie Belle, pumping her right foreleg. "Oh my God," said Harry, "it worked. And it didn't kill us." The 3 fillies ignored him in favor of immediately turning to look at their flanks. "Ah, horsefeathers," said Scootaloo at not seeing a cutie mark. A moment later, they heard a crash. The fillies ran as fast as they could while Harry hurried as fast as he dared. The boulder had gone almost 200 feet before hitting a tree, and snapping it in half while knocking it over. Oops, said Scootaloo. Horse feathers. AJ's gonna kill me. They started kicking and pushing the boulder back to the siege machine. They had barely moved it 50 feet before they heard the pounding of hoofbeats. Celestia, I'm in so much trouble, mumbled Apple Bloom, shaking her head dejectedly. Applejack came into view at a full run, with Big Mac right beside her. They slowed on seeing the three fillies and Harry. Harry sighed. He knew the script for this story. He would end up being blamed and banned from seeing Apple Bloom, which would mean losing the other two as friends as well. Well, it had been fun for the short while it lasted. On the other hand, or hoof, they had saved his life. And the few times he had admitted to doing something wrong back in Little Whinging, his punishments had not been as severe, at least at school. Applejack and Big Mac came to a halt and alternated looking at the boulder, and the splintered broken tree. What in tarnation happened here? Applejack stared at Apple Bloom accusingly. She already suspected the CMC were responsible for this mayhem, the only question was how. Well, started Apple Bloom. Started Sweetie Belle. Scootaloo tried to look innocent, as if she had no idea what Applejack was talking about. It's my fault, Harry said. Five heads swiveled to look at him, with expressions of varying degrees of incredulity. When the girls showed me the trebuchet they built, I couldn't wait to see it work, he continued. Applejack looked at Big Mac and mouthed the word trebuchet. It looked just so cool. So we loaded the bucket with rocks and then put this boulder in it. I should have said something about which way we were aiming, but I was in too much of a hurry to see it work, so I didn't say anything. Which was a lie. He hadn't paid any attention at all to which way the silly thing was pointing, he hadn't even expected it to work. But if it kept the girls from getting into any trouble, then it was worth it. Applejack looked at him, then sadly shook her head. Oh, Harry, you can't lie to me. Didn't Apple Bloom tell you hold the element of honesty? I can smell a lie faster than you can say it. Harry let his head hang down. That was right, Apple Bloom had mentioned it. He had just thought it meant she was really bad at telling lies, not that she could detect lies, too. Let's try again. What happened? 10 minutes later, the two adult ponies watched with dropped jaws as a repositioned trebuchet launched its boulder 200 feet down the path between Sweet Apple Acres and the Everfree forest. It smashed into a tree at the edge of the forest, breaking the trunk in half. They had been aiming for the middle of the path. Applejack looked at the siege engine. Why in tarnation did you all build this? Well, Apple Bloom explained, I was doing homework on the Earth Pony tribe 2 weeks ago and the book mentioned the ancient siege engines the Minotaurs used against them. She started to get excited, and I thought, hey, there's something we could try, building siege engines. So, I went to the library and asked Twilight Sparkle if she had any books on how siege engines were made. She pulled a couple off the shelves and I copied the plans for the one that looked easiest to build. The arithmetic was difficult, but Sweetie Belle worked it out. Yeah, said Sweetie Belle, getting into the story. The book had these equations that all I had to do was put in the weight we wanted to throw and then when I finished the arithmetic it told us how long each piece in the engine had to be to work. I figured about a pony's weight would be cool. Applejack sat down and stared at the trebuchet. Harry figured she would be having words with Twilight about just which books she allowed the fillies to read. Harry turned and looked, too. It was quite a work of art, actually. And 3 fillies had built it in a week. That said volumes about their commitment to the project and how hard they had worked. It even had their names carved into its side. Harry was impressed. He couldn't imagine anyone from his primary school doing anything like this, not even if a whole class worked on it. Applejack slowly stood, then faced the 4 of them. I am impressed, she said slowly. The fillies burst into brilliant smiles. Harry frowned. He knew there was a big, but, about to be said. In cases like this, there always was. But, she continued as the filly's ears fell back, y'all made quite a mess out of one of my trees. She stared at them threateningly. They spent the rest of the day, and after school the next day, chopping the ruined apple tree into smaller wood stove-sized pieces. They picked up the cut pieces and hauled them back to the house to cure for next year's use. Big Mac was their occasional supervisor. Oddly, they discovered that the center of the tree was rotted out. Applejack had noticed that for the last 2 harvests that tree's apples hadn't been as good as the other trees. She would have probably had it removed in a few years, anyway. The CMC had just moved up the removal date. 2 weeks later, on Saturday, when the fillies were finally off being grounded, they were once more standing beside their siege engine, at Scootaloo's insistence. You know, Scootaloo said speculatively, I bet I could fly farther than that apple tree with this thing. Sweetie Belle looked at her. What? Apple Bloom looked at Scootaloo, and then at the trebuchet, and then back at her again. Then the red-maned pony's eyes went wide open. Ya aren't thinkin'. Harry looked at Scootaloo and put his right foreleg over his eyes. Yes, Apple Bloom, that is exactly what she's thinking. He walked over to Scootaloo. It's too dangerous. We have no control over where you would go, and hitting a tree, even by accident could kill you. But that won't happen. I can fly. I know I can. Harry closed his eyes. He had a headache starting. Then, he had an idea. He smiled. Sweetie Belle. She looked at him. Isn't there a lake nearby? Yes. Ponyville Lake. After a thoughtful pause, she smiled, too. It took them almost 2 hours to haul the siege engine to the lake. Just following the path didn't do it, as sometimes 2 trees grew too close together for the trebuchet to fit between them, thus they had to find a way around them. Still, soon enough, they were looking down the small incline to the lake. Harry studied the lake and then the trebuchet. They were about 100 feet away and the lake looked easily to be twice the length of a football field across from here. Perfect. No chance of overshooting. Let's move the trebuchet over to the side by that tree. We don't want to block the path, he suggested. Once it was in place, and blocks placed to prevent it from rolling, they pulled the throwing arm down, set the linch pin, and then set the looped end of the throwing rope over the holding peg at the tip of the arm. With 4 of them at work, it didn't take long. While the 3 fillies started getting Scootaloo ready, Harry ran the rope from the linch pin over around the nearby tree trunk and back over to the fillies. This was a dangerous scheme, but he knew he wouldn't be able to talk Scootaloo out of it. And she had saved his life. It was his turn to keep her safe. Is your helmet on tight? Asked Sweetie Belle as she used her magic to give the strap a sharp tug. Yep. Give me your saddlebags, you don't need them, said Apple Bloom, pulling the release strap with her teeth. He knelt down and tied the rope loosely around Scootaloo's leg. Are your wings okay? Not tired or anything? Scootaloo rolled her eyes, but stretched her small wings out. They're just fine. Harry trotted calmly over to the trough and settled himself onto the cloth launching cup. He pulled the cloth cup up over his back and made sure all his hooves were tucked tight against his torso. Hey, called Scootaloo, what are you doing, Harry? She started towards him. Just making sure this is safe for you girls, Harry called back. Harry saw Scootaloo feel her left rear leg get pulled as the rope went tight against the tree. Scowling, she took another step and yanked her leg forward, thinking Apple Bloom had grabbed her hoof. The rope went taut. Apple Bloom said, Hey. What's with the rope? Sweetie Belle said, Stop, Scootaloo, stop. Harry watched as Scootaloo yanked her leg again, turned, and yelled at Apple Bloom, Let my leg go. He heard the pop as the linchpin came free. The cloth cup was suddenly hard against his back. He slid halfway down the trough, then felt himself lifted into the air. The world shot by faster than any car he had ever ridden in as he was slung around in a half-circle and found himself flying through the air upside down. To the side, then below, and then behind him he heard 3 shrill voices fading away behind him, Harry. He tumbled out of control through the air. The sky alternated with ground and then water. It was kinda fun, he thought, until he realized all he could see was the water rushing up at him. Then his plan's flaw in trying the trebuchet first came to mind. He didn't know how to swim. The splashdown knocked the air out of him. He kicked furiously, terrified he was about to drown. His head popped to the surface and he took a deep breath before going under again. But he had kicked himself to the surface, he started paddling and kicking as hard as he could. And, remarkably, he returned to the surface and stayed there. He was doing a dog-pony paddle. He didn't have the slightest idea where he was going, but at least he wasn't drowning. Until, that is, Scootaloo almost ran him over. She was clutching a board in the water barely bigger than she was, and her wings were beating like a hummingbird. "Are you all right?" she cried. "Ah," he said, "don't kill me." He paddled frantically, turning to keep her in sight after the board's wake rolled water over his head. She didn't. Instead, she gave him the board to hold while she hooked her legs around his body and used her wings to propel them back to shore. Now that he knew it wouldn't kill them, the trebuchet became the ultimate diving board. They each took turns, with Scootaloo going the farthest, of course. Harry kept his hooves on the ground, and would stay there until he felt confident that he could swim across the lake without drowning first. By then it was mid-morning and the other kids seeking a little recreational swimming started to show up. And they wanted to try the pony thrower, as they called it. A line rapidly developed with eager teams of Earth and Unicorn fillies and colts pulling down the firing arm in anticipation of their own experience at flying like a Pegasus. Contests quickly developed for the most tricks performed before splashdown. And most graceful. And biggest splash. The loud, and unusually clear, happy screams coming from the vicinity of the Ponyville Lake, now that the screamers were higher than the hill between the town and the lake, quickly drew the attention of the adults. Just what were the fillies and colts up to this time? But it's not made for adults, Sweetie Belle explained. I designed the weight for a filly or colt. You won't make it to the lake. I'll go first, said a Pegasus stallion. If I fall short, I can just fly instead. He didn't fall short. He didn't go as far as the fillies and colts, but he made it past the shallows. Screaming adults brought the rest of the town to the lake. Unfortunately, the adults modified the pony pitcher, as it had now been renamed, so that an adult had to be there to unlock the arm for use. But, then again, that wouldn't be too difficult a thing to accomplish, based on the adult scream coming from the trebuchet as it swept yet another earth mare off the trough and flung her out across the lake at almost 100 miles an hour. That was by far faster than any non-Pegasus had ever moved before, even the fastest of Equestria's trains didn't top more than 45. Indeed, the problem might be getting the adults to leave enough time for the fillies and colts to use it. To prevent the trebuchet from being moved, the CMC, with some help from the other colts and fillies, leveled part of the hill, removed the wheels, and anchored the frame with short posts. The trebuchet was now a permanent fixture for Lakeside fun. A fitting end, Harry thought, for something designed to destroy. Almost every morning was surreal. Harry had never shared a room before. Waking to a room lit by the morning sun was merely unusual. When he stayed with Mrs. Fig she let him sleep in a real bed, which was softer and more comfortable than his cot in the cupboard, but not by much, and she didn't make him fix her breakfast, lunch, or dinner. But the rest? Yeah, surreal. Listening to them lightly snoring, was there a spell that could stop that? Not that it was a real problem, just curiosity, while lying in a bed so soft it might as well have been a cloud. Moving his legs under the covers, no hands or feet anymore, watching the shadows play across the ceiling and walls as he just enjoyed not doing anything and knowing he wasn't going to be punished for it. He usually started on his meditations. Eventually, though, his bladder would inform him that he needed to move. The bathroom upstairs was spacious, much more so than he had expected. The tub and shower were larger, which they would have to be to fit a mostly horizontal quadruped instead of a vertical biped. The toilet was an experience. And awkward for a biped, which he wasn't anymore. But he was never in a hurry. At first, he didn't use the tub/shower because he was afraid he'd make Twilight angry if he woke her and she couldn't immediately use the facilities herself. Later, he waited as a courtesy to his host. As quietly as possible, he'd sneak down the stairs, no easy feat when your feet are actually hard-bone hooves. No matter how gently he placed his hooves down, there was always a little clunk. Still, he usually managed to make it to the ground floor without waking the others. He always started the day reading and studying. He tried to find the simplest of the books on a given subject and levitate it down, that is, he used his levitation magic to pull the book far enough forward off the shelf for it to fall. The first time he had done that, it had hit him on head. Hooves, he had found, were terrible at catching things. He had sighed. Note to self, he had murmured, rubbing his forehead, "Don't stand under objects you are learning to levitate." Then he would retire to the reading table and settle in. Which was where Twilight and Spike would find him when they came downstairs. After breakfast, and his shower, he would go off to school during the week, and off with the cutie mark crusaders on the weekends. The evenings he spent reading up on the topics he didn't know that every colt and filly knew: history, literature, geography, and everything about the princesses and nobles in Canterlot. Which, coming from a human world, he found fascinating instead of the boring tedium that the other colts and fillies complained about. And being grounded in a library, after yet another cutie mark crusade misadventure, wasn't something he would call punishment. Headmaster Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, Order of Merlin, First Class, Grand Sorcerer, Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot, and Supreme Mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards, looked up from his desk and smiled slightly. He waved his hand gently. The door to his office at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry opened just as his deputy headmistress, Professor McGonagall, reached the landing outside it. "What can I do for you this wonderful morning, Minerva?" he asked congenially, leaning back in his chair. "The same thing you do every year at this time, Albus," she replied in her usual no-nonsense tone. "Tell me how Harry Potter is doing." She sighed as she sat in the chair opposite his desk. "This is his 10th birthday. Only one more year before he comes to Hogwarts." Smiling, the old wizard looked at the bookshelf against the wall of his office and behind his Transfigurations professor. To anyone else, he looked as if he was simply looking up and thinking. Instead, he was examining 3 certain silver devices hidden among the several dozen residing on the bookcase's top shelf. "Let's see," he said thoughtfully. He studied them as if he didn't check them every day, after waking and before bed. One looked like a metronome, its black wand moving slightly back and forth instead of standing straight up or pointing to either side. Its triangular backing and round base were both a neutral silver-gray in color, although the backing had 13 horizontal black lines that divided it into 14 equally tall sections. He closed his eyes momentarily and said, "Harry is doing well, but he is neither happy nor sad." "I would expect him to be excited on his birthday," she said, frowning severely. "Perhaps he is still asleep," the headmaster gently countered, his eyes twinkling. "Sleeping in on such occasions is not unusual. Still, it is rather odd that every time I ask, you give the same response. I find it troubling that Harry never seems to be happy." She shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Dumbledore shrugged delicately. "The burdens of being brought up by your aunt and uncle instead of your mother and father, I expect," he said. He looked to his next instrument, a squat, round tube lying on its side and sealed at both ends. A long thin smokestack, almost as tall as a textbook and taller than the cylinder was long, stuck up from the nearest end. 11 black lines divided the cylinder into 12 sections, and all were a dull silver gray. It was sending up small puffs of white smoke from its chimney. Its square base was a bright silver platform. Again, he closed his eyes, then said, "He is in good health, and has been for the last year, as usual. No injuries of any kind, not even a minor scrape." McGonagall shook her head. "Now that is unusual. His grandmother told me his father never made it through a week without some kind of cut or scrape, even if it was just tripping on the front steps and barking his shin. His mother, on the other hand, the old wizard said, rarely had such problems, I recall you telling me. Professor McGonagall reluctantly nodded. The headmaster looked at the third device on the shelf. A simple vertical wheel spinning and shimmering with all the colors of the rainbow. Its base was oblong. And the support was a half circle. It was actually a bit hypnotic, and he sometimes found himself watching it when he was stressed. He smiled. His mother's protection on the Dursley home is still as active as ever, he said happily. Showing that he is getting the love he needs from his aunt. It certainly isn't as great as his mother's. But it is there. Just as it has been for the last 9 years. And, no one has attempted to breach the protective charm since I placed it. He looked back at his deputy in mild reproof. She nodded. So, Minerva, he said softly, have I managed to lay to rest your concerns for the coming year? I still think you should visit Harry instead of relying solely on monitoring charms. Even the Muggle social workers visit their charges on occasion to evaluate what is really happening instead of relying on second-hand information. He shrugged, a visit might inadvertently disclose his location to wizards we would rather not have that knowledge. A skilled practitioner could follow even me without being detected were I to chance it. Which is the reason why I've requested you and Hagrid to not visit the child, and all the others to not look for him. And can you imagine what the Daily Prophet would print if they knew he was living with Muggles? And how to find him? And what the Wizengamot would do in reaction? Or the Death Eaters that managed to escape capture 10 years ago? She shuddered, yes. She fixed him with a steady gaze. But monitoring charms can only tell you so much. Visiting Harry, if only for a few minutes, would tell you more. Again, he shrugged. My charms are rather thorough. I have complete faith in them in relaying to me all the relevant information I need. He smiled at her, besides, Mrs. Fig checks up on him regularly. Minerva rolled her eyes. A squib who sees the boy once every few months when the Dursleys ask her to watch him is not the same as going into their home and seeing his living conditions, Albus. And if the Dursleys don't call her, she can tell us nothing. She doesn't even live on the same street, so she can't tell us if she happens to see him outside in the summer. And didn't you tell me that last year they only called her 4 times, including just once since January? Half-heartedly, the headmaster nodded. Yes. And as he gets older I imagine they will rely on her even less. However, if he were to come over to her house and showed signs of being treated badly, she would have told us. And she can't very well sneak over there and peek in their windows, now, can she? Reluctantly, she said. No. Well, I guess this will just have to do, won't it? She sighed. I still think placing him with those Muggles was a mistake. He sighed, in turn. We've been over this before, Minerva. I had no real choice. Black was in Azkaban, Amelia had lost almost her entire family and was in no shape to take on a toddler. Mary, Emmeline, Hestia, and Dorcas were all single. And Remus' monthly problem would have made it impossible to keep his location a secret. Plus, the Death Eaters were carefully checking all the Grey and Light families looking for the child in the days after the attack, and before the Longbottoms were targeted. So, my choices were either the Dursleys or sending him overseas. He looked her levelly in the eyes. I stand by my choice. I know, she muttered softly. I just wish it could have been different. She stood. I'll see you at lunch, then. She left his office, the door silently closing behind her. Dumbledore sighed and looked at his 4th monitoring device, a simple vertical stick on a small round disc, with 3 lights in a small vertical rectangular box on top. A Muggle would immediately recognize its traffic pole shape. As it always was, the red and yellow lights remained unlit while the green one glowed dimly. He hadn't told anyone of the existence of the last 2 of the 5 devices on the shelf designed to monitor the boy at all times. While the wizards couldn't find Harry at home, that didn't prevent a clever Death Eater from hiring or charming an unknowing Muggle into doing their dirty work for them. It might take years for such a strategy to work, but Death Eaters were known to be patient when necessary. Thus, the fourth device monitored his very special Muggle-repelling charm on Harry. Any Muggle with the intent to kill Harry, remove him from his relatives, or trying to interfere in the family, would be subtly redirected and made to forget what they had intended to do. It reinforced anything his aunt and uncle told others, to help distract attention from Harry. If they told someone to leave the boy alone, that person would do just that. The old wizard was pleased to see that the all-black device hadn't the least bit of color anywhere except the green light. That meant no one had approached the boy or interfered in his relationship with the Dursleys for at least a year. The same as all the previous times he had checked. Like the other devices, it tracked Harry for the last 12 months, or 14 days for the happiness monitor. He hadn't bothered to make the devices track things any longer, not seeing the necessity. Albus next looked at the crystal globe filled entirely with white smoke, last of the 5 devices monitoring Harry. It was on a simple silver base. He smiled to himself. That had been a slide of genius, although devilishly hard to cast correctly. It watched Dumbledore's special version of the Fidelius charm that redirected any wizard's or witch's attention away from the one who had vanquished Lord Voldemort. Harry Potter, for the wizards and witches, was forever linked to the missing Dark Lord. They could not think of one without thinking of the other. Hence, any wizard or witch searching for him would be blocked by the charm. Muggles, on the other hand, would only know of Harry Potter, not his wizarding history, and have no such impediment. And should a wizard see him, well, while they would recognize him, they would never be able to remember where or when it had happened. And if a quick-thinking wizard were to see him and place a tracking or monitoring charm of any kind on the boy, Dumbledore's special variation of the Fidelius would block it from reporting anything useful. The charm would appear to work, but report nothing of consequence. And that would keep the boy safe from all harm. "Where is our little pumpkin?" asked Petunia, as she walked into the sitting room. "The roast is almost done." The aroma of the evening dinner drifted through the house: roast beef with caramelized onions and gravy, roast potatoes with cinnamon butter, carrots and peas, and Yorkshire pudding. A delicious blend of scents that set her husband's mouth to drooling. "You know how he likes your dinners. I'm sure the little rascal will be home any moment," said Vernon jovially as he watched news and sport on BBC Two. "I certainly hope so," she replied, glancing back into the kitchen. "He has been spending a lot more time with his friends lately." The obese man glanced up at her, then scowled. "Well, now that freak is out of our lives, our son has more free time. And he's out of that boy's disrupting influence." He fell silent for a moment. She sighed, eyeing the cupboard door which they hadn't opened in days. "He's only been missing for 2 weeks. He might show up again. I feel that our luck has finally changed, my love. He's gone, and gone for good." "One can only hope," she said. She frowned. "I wonder what set him off." Her husband grunted. "Who cares? He probably found a mug that he could leech off of. Good riddance to bad rubbish, I say. If we never see him again, it'll be too soon. Dear Princess Celestia. It's probably good that we haven't found that portal to Harry Potter's homeworld yet. The more I learn about those beasts he calls relatives, the more I find myself wanting to hurt them. I'm trying not to be a bad pony, but the details he's mentioned see in closed notes make it so difficult sometimes. The things he's told me about his homeworld, though, are simply astounding. If we do find the portal, or it reopens, the things we could learn will revolutionize magic and science as we know it. See the enclosed notes on the things he's told me about. Harry seems to have made friends with Apple Bloom, Sweetie Belle, and Scuttler the Cutie Mark Crusaders, in case you don't remember. I've written to you of their escapades in the past. I'm hoping this both helps him integrate better into our world and to slow them down. He seems to be more cautious than they are, so there's hope on that subject. See my enclosed notes on the trebuchet they built, and its current use at Ponyville Lake. It's truly amazing how many of their cutie mark attempts end up with them covered in tree sap, even those that have nothing to do with the forest or trees. He's fitting well into school, cheerily tells me. He's very quiet and polite, and studies hard. I told you about his innovation on using his fetlock to hold a quill, and how we fashioned a quill holder for his hoof C enclosed and improved diagram. His letters are already about as good as the average Pegasus. Cheerily has said several Earth colts are showing interest in his method of writing. It certainly seems like something we should consider teaching instead of mouth writing, much more convenient and easier to use. I've been running tests on his magic and he appears to have a magic well that is quite wide and deep for a colt his age. He will be quite a power pony when he gets older. His scar, though, concerns me. It is definitely a fragment of something and not simply a remnant of a spell gone wrong. Its reactions to my diagnostic spells remind me strongly of the fragment of Sombra's horn we found C in closed charts and records. How he could have acquired it is also troubling. He says he's had it as long as he can remember, which means that whatever happened to him, it was when he was a tiny foal. Some pony was casting highly dangerous spells either around him or at him, resulting in this scar. How could his parents have allowed this? And if not them, then his relatives. C. Enclosed notes on what he can remember about the scar. And, most importantly, should we tell him about it? See enclosed notes on the pros and cons of such a decision. And then there is that protective magic field surrounding him. The only thing it responds to is that scar. Nothing else I've thrown at it gets any sort of reaction. It's as if the magic field's only purpose is to keep whatever is in the scar at bay. How the field was established and how it maintains itself leave me frustrated. All my attempts to create a similar field have ended in abysmal failure as they either drain magic from the subject or dissipate after only a few hours. And my field reacts to every spell I cast at it. Whomever created this field was an exceptionally knowledgeable, talented, and powerful magic user. See enclosed notes on the recordings and my tentative conclusions. This is at odds with his firm statements that magic is unknown in his world. No matter how I look at it, my conclusions are disturbing in their implications. See enclosed notes. Any suggestions you might have would be greatly appreciated. Your faithful student. Twilight Sparkle. Note, I have run into a small problem with Harry. How do I punish him when he does something wrong? I don't want to do anything that might remind him of his relatives and cause a panic attack or cause him lose his trust in us, yet the normal punishments, grounding him and making him stay inside, don't seem to work. That is, when I grounded him after the trebuchet incident at Sweet Apple Acres, he has to stay inside and can't go play with his friends. He spent the entire time reading books. He acted like he was being rewarded. He even thanked me. Princess Celestia hoofed the letter from her faithful student to her sister, Luna. Have you been able to learn anything helpful about Harry Potter from his dreams? She asked. Luna sighed as she read the letter. No, Tia. His dreams are extremely chaotic compared to most ponies. If it weren't for his obvious calm acceptance of the events taking place, we would think he were reliving one of Discord's more extreme pranks from a millennia ago when that villainous creature ruled Equestria. She stopped for a moment to think. His dreams segue from one disquieting fantastical setting to another in chaotic and what should be traumatizing manners. At times, sections or entire dreams rapidly repeat over and over with minor variations in details and outcomes that should leave him an emotional wreck in the morning. One moment he is a pony, another he is in his bipedal form, and in still another he is an odd combination of both. He barely notices the changes, and doesn't seem to care one way or another, accepting all with equal tranquility. She shook her head tiredly. We can't say what is of his world, what is of ours, and what is fantasy. We tried to stop one such misadventure the very first time we entered his dreamscape, to direct it and receive answers. All we accomplished was to reset the dream to a different beginning, and it dragged me with it willy-nilly. Every time we interfere, the dreams just change their theme and remain thoroughly as chaotic and confusing. She sighed and laid her head on the table. And he sees nothing wrong with what's happening. He participates and reacts, but nothing seems to matter. His moods range from mildly worried to mildly pleased, even when what he doest has no bearing on what happens. She looked over at her sister. If it weren't for Twilight's reports on his interactions with other ponies, we would think him quite insane. Celestia hummed softly. Although, we must admit amusement at seeing that thine faithful student complains that restricting him to the library as punishment doest not work. We don't think we hast ever heard of such a state of affairs. She glanced up at her sister with a slight smile. Yes, said the white alicorn, that is a rather ironic complaint from Twilight. Mayhaps, denying him the books wouldst work. Celestia sighed. That was what I had to do with Twilight. They both studied their teacups for several minutes. You should head for bed, Lulu, Celestia suggested. You're about to fall asleep on your hooves. And you're speaking in the royal we again. She gave her sister a loving look. There certainly doesn't appear to be any urgency in this matter, at least not enough to require you to skimp on your slumber. Forsooth, I think thou mayhaps be correct. Princess Luna pushed herself to her hooves and slowly walked to the door. Good morning, Tia. Good morning, Lulu. Harry stared critically at the trebuchet as it launched another pony into the lake, this one doing various flips and spins before diving forehooves first into the lake. Her friends at the pony pitcher cheered, then rapidly pulled the arm back for the next launch. How you didn't get a cutie mark for that I'll never understand, he said quietly. A series of disappointed sighs sounded beside him. Well, said Apple Bloom, it really wasn't that hard. It's just a bunch of tree trunks we tied and nailed together. I think the hardest parts were the pegs and the throwing arm. They sat watching, waiting their turn. Maybe we should make another just for the kids, he said. They get a bit restless waiting for their turn. He looked at the fillies. A pony pitcher for goats. Harry rolled his eyes. Kids, another word for fillies and colts younger than us. He sighed. It wouldn't be as large and we could place it closer to the lake. That would also get some of the grown-ups off this one as they help their fillies and colts with the new one. The fillies thought that over for a moment, then smiled. We'll start Monday, after school, Sweetie Belle said decisively as they moved forward another few steps in the line. That Monday evening Harry discovered just how difficult it was to remove tree sap from one's fur. On the other hand, it was the first time he had ever had a long hot bath. That the fillies were with him in the tub was embarrassing at first, but their matter-of-fact attitude quickly put him at ease. Then he discovered the dubious joys of waiting for fur to dry in a dusty barn. He was much more careful on the remaining nights. It didn't prevent him from getting tree sap on his coat, but there was much less of it. Although the hot baths with the fillies were a fair recompense, he decided, for getting rid of the sap. On Friday they pulled the finished filly flinger, as Scootaloo named it, into position. The previous day, with the enthusiastic help of their school friends, they had leveled the prospective resting place much closer to the lake. For this one, they had dug 4 holes for the posts that would hold the smaller siege engine firmly in place. They removed the wheels, they had reused the other trebuchet's wheels, and placed the holding posts. They then packed the now-filled post holes with rocks and sand. Judicious stomping by Apple Bloom tamped everything firmly in place. They used a much smaller bucket so the smaller fillies and colts weren't sent nearly as fast or as far as the bigger one would throw them. That, in turn, meant it was easier to prepare each time and the round trips were shorter, making for more rides for the smaller ponies. The icing on the cake, as far as the Cutie Mark Crusaders were concerned, was overhearing some grown-ups deciding to build a bigger pony pitcher just for them, giving Ponyville 3 trebuchets as a recreational activity for all ages. The addition of anchored rafts. Close, but not too close, to the splashdown areas made it safer. And ponies didn't have to swim immediately back to shore. Even the Pegasi had gotten into the act, using the trebuchet as a dodgeball game, where the thrown Pegasus tried to aim for the hovering target. Usually, a Pegasus could see an approaching opponent miles away, and could hear the air disturbance of their wings at a good distance. It was a great reflex improver to have an opponent suddenly pop up less than 2 seconds away and headed for you at great speed. At some point, a unicorn had decided to participate. The unexpected participant shooting spells rapidly at the surprised Pegasus playing target added a heretofore unforeseen dimension to aerial combat. The Pegasi, fanatical adrenaline junkies that they were delighted at the new challenges this provided. The trebuchets had become quite popular on the hot summer days. Even kids and adults from some of the closer villages were coming over to try them out. And Pegasi from all over were appearing at the lake. Harry looked down at the 4 timberwolves circling their tree and sighed. The 3 fillies were on branches above him, which kept the wolves' attention on him. It had seemed like a good idea at the time. Harry, Apple Bloom had said after school, "I'll wanna introduce you to Zekra." Sweetie Belle had interrupted, "AB, you know we're not supposed to go into the Everfree after school." The 4 of them had been trotting towards the clubhouse. "Ah, don't be that way," she had replied. "We won't be long, and we'll stick right to the trail. If we hurry, we'll be back home long before dinner." Zerkora had asked Harry. There followed the complete story of how the zebra had scared all the Ponyville residents, with the main 6 getting dosed with poison joke and turned into their humiliating opposites. Twilight's horn turned limp and flaccid, making her Twilight flopple. Rainbow Dash's wings turned upside down and on her lower sides, she became Rainbow Crash. Applejack shrank down to fit on a pony's hoof and became Apple Teeny. Rarity's mane, coat, and tail became frizzled, very long, and mop-like, making her Harity. Pinkie Pie's tongue became swollen and covered in blue spots, making her speak unintelligibly, and giving her the name Spitty Pie. And Fluttershy's voice dropped several octaves and she became Flutterguy. By the time the story was over, the colt and fillies had arrived at the forest's edge. And, somehow, had all now agreed that visiting Zekra just had to be done. "It's a short walk," Apple Bloom had assured him, "not more than 10 minutes. I've made the trip many times. She's been teaching me how to make potions." The forest had been as foreboding as always, with that hint of malice and decay in the air that it always held. The trail Apple Bloom had set out on was at least a well-marked path. Unfortunately, it wasn't all that wide and they had been restricted to single file in the darkness under the trees. It had been Harry's first foray into the forest since his original escape. He had to say the forest was just as intimidating as he had been told. He had been in too much pain to notice when he had first arrived. 5 minutes later, they had heard rustling to their left. "Maybe we should go a bit faster," Sweetie Belle had suggested nervously. They had sped up from a nervous walk to a trot. Then they had heard rustling behind them. No one said anything, but they nervously had started to move faster. Then a timberwolf had jumped onto the trail in front of them. Apple Bloom had shrieked in surprise. They had spun to race back home, only to see another timberwolf standing there, growling. They had taken off into the forest to their right. Moments later, a crash from in front of them had revealed another timberwolf. Which was how they had been treed by 4 timberwolves. "Ah, horse feathers," said Apple Bloom. She looked around them at the other trees. "Ah, can see the edge of the Everfree, right over thar." She pointed with a hoof and slipped. She grabbed her branch with all 4 limbs. Whoa! One of the timberwolves moved from below Harry to stand below Apple Bloom, sappy saliva dripping from its snout. Harry sighed. Just like being chased by Dudley. Only with magical creatures. With magic. 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 He studied the branches around them. Just below him, to his right, was another big branch. He didn't know any cutting spells, yet, he was still working on levitating things, but maybe Sweetie Belle did from helping her sister. "Hey, Sweetie Belle," he called up to her and explained what he wanted to try. It didn't work, at first. She had to use the spell almost a dozen times while he tried to hold the end of the branch pulled slightly towards himself. Soon enough, though, there was a loud crack and the weight of the branch tore it from the tree trunk. Harry's hold, of course, failed almost immediately. But it held just long enough to swing the branch in his direction as it plummeted down and onto the head of the timber wolf under his branch. There was a loud smash and thud. The front half of the timber wolf was crushed under the branch. As he watched, the back half simply fell apart into sticks and leaves. Apple Bloom leaned up against another branch as the colt and filly went to work on the branch she was standing on. Just as she noticed it starting to sink, she jumped to the new branch, and broke the other free. It squashed the wolf under her quite nicely. Unfortunately, the other two wolves moved away from their tree and sat nearby. But not too unfortunate, as Harry and Sweetie Belle transferred their actions to the tree the two wolves were sitting under. A sturdy branch did the job, smashing one timber wolf and trapping or crippling the other. Harry," said Apple Bloom. "That first timber wolf is almost back." Harry looked. Terrifyingly, beside the first branch they had sent down, he could see the crude form of a wolf slowly bulking up. They scrambled down and headed for the orchard as fast as they could. Just as they reached the edge, they could hear the howl of a frustrated wolf echoing out of the forest. They didn't stop running until they reached the farmhouse. They stood there, sides heaving. "Ah, Horsefeathers," said Apple Bloom. The others looked at her curiously. She was rubbing her forehoof against her side. She looked back up and said, "Sap." The other three groaned and started checking themselves out. Apple Bloom's sour answer of, "crusading," somehow managed to deflect her sister's question about their afternoon escapade. They didn't have to explain why they were in the Everfree forest. Apparently, Applejack and Big Mac assumed the White-Tail Woods beside the lake were the source of their sappiness. It was at lunchtime the next day that Diamond Tiara and Silver Spoon came over again. She had been harassing Harry and the Cutie Mark Crusaders for several weeks now. "Well, blank flanks, what are you going to do to get in trouble today?" She ignored Harry, speaking to Scootaloo, the one most likely to lose her temper. She had learned that trying to torment Harry wasn't worth the effort. He never responded, he just stared at her. She would have said he wasn't very smart, but his arithmetic and ponyish skills made that impossible. That and the fact that the way he just stared at her made her uneasy. And he was so small. She always felt like she was talking to a foe when she talked to him. Scootaloo rolled her eyes, but before she could more than open her mouth, Harry said, "Are you Sue? Insecure in your own self-worth that the only way you can feel good about yourself is to put down others over things they have no control over?" Tiara, and her friend Silver Spoon, just stared at him. That he talked more like an adult than any of them, despite his resemblance to a much younger foal, was oddly disturbing. "Sure, Scootaloo, Sweetie Belle, Apple Bloom, and myself don't have our cutie marks yet, but who cares, really? Look at all the fun things we do trying to find our marks while you just sit around, bored, doing nothing truly interesting because you already have a cutie mark. Where's the excitement in your life? Have you ever tried taffy making, hairdressing, mountain climbing, or underwater exploring? Have you ever put on your own talent show? We did. We even built the pony pitcher and filly flinger that you've had so much fun with these last 2 weeks. What have you done? As far as I can tell, nothing. Except maybe a few dozen tea parties with Silver Spoon. If being a blank flank, as you so dismissively call us, lets us have so much fun, then I would rather remain a blank flank. And today, we're going to see how sofas are made. Maybe that's the talent for one of us. We don't know, but we'll have fun trying. What will you do for fun after school? Have yet another tea party?" Harry stopped and resumed his stare. He had learned long ago that the best defense against bullies was to ignore them, to not react to what they did unless they went to violence. And his steady blank stare always unsettled them. It had even worked on Dudley, sometimes. The fillies stared at him wide-eyed. "Well, I never." Tiara said, at a loss for what to say, and just saying what her mother said when she was surprised by another's response, Harry assumed. The colt nodded. "And that's why we have more fun than you do. Because you never." She umphed, turning to walk away. The bell rang, signaling the end of lunch, and the end of the confrontation. If it could be called that. They started towards the door, letting the unhappy Tiara and friend get ahead of them. "We're going to make a sofa?" asked Sweetie Belle. Said Harry, "sorry about that." He shook his head. He would have rubbed his neck if they weren't walking. "It was the first thing I thought of," he pointed with his nose at Ponyville. Barely visible in the distance behind where Tiara had been standing during their encounter, they could see the vague outline of the Quills and Sofas shop. Scootaloo laughed. "Well, why not?" she said happily. Harry had to admit later, as they walked into Quills and Sofas after school, that he would never have thought the two went together, but seeing all the pillows and cushions proudly displayed with signs that read, "Made from the finest down feathers," explained it. After all, if you're collecting feathers for sofa cushions and pillows, it's not unlikely you would get a few big ones as well. Using the big ones to make quills was simply another way to turn a discard into profit. "Welcome," said a voice from the back of the shop accompanied by the clip-clop of someone hurrying in their direction. "Good afternoon. I'm Davenport, the proprietor of this establishment. What can I do for you?" His voice trailed off as he caught sight of them. He did not look happy. His eyes narrowed and he stared at them nervously. "What do you want?" he said flatly, their reputation clearly in mind. "Hi," said Scootaloo excitedly, "we're the Cutie Mark Crusaders." "Yes," said the Earth Pony, looking even more nervous and taking a step backwards as if afraid he might catch a disease. Or thought he was inside collateral damage range. "I see our reputation precedes us," Harry said dryly. He cleared his throat. "We were wondering if you could show us how sofas and quills are made." The pony sighed in resignation. "Wow," said Apple Bloom, "this is really springy." She was using a nearby sofa as a trampoline. Sweetie Belle was looking under the cushions of another one. Scootaloo was somewhere. Harry placed his hoof over his eyes. "Girls," he said sharply, "focus." There was a crash from the back room, followed immediately by Scootaloo's voice, "I'm all right." Davenport wheeled and ran into his back room, Harry and the other two fillies on his heels. He lifted the errant filly out of the sofa frame that was on the floor and now slightly twisted. Harry looked around the room. It was much larger than he had expected. There was a table saw, jigsaw, and sander, all hoof-powered, against the wall, with various hoof tools racked on the wall above them. On the opposite wall were racks of cloth and a large sewing table. At the back were several sofas in various stages of completion. The next half hour was difficult for the poor shopkeeper as he tried to explain how he created his custom sofas. Apple Bloom got trapped in the pulleys under the table saw. Sweetie Belle got tied up in the threads under the hoof-powered sewing machine. She was trying to figure out how the machine did what she and her sister used magic to do. And Scootaloo, somehow, got stuck inside an almost completed sofa. "Sorry about your sofa, Mr. Davenport," Scootaloo said as he escorted them to his front door. "That's all right," the pony said with a pained expression, "that sofa needed a new backing, anyway. And it should only take an hour or so to untangle the sewing machine threads." "Sorry," said Sweetie Belle, blushing. "And the belts on that saw were getting worn anyway." Apple Bloom said nothing, but her bright red face said it all. Just as the fillies were going out the door, Harry stopped. "Excuse me, Mr. Davenport, but do you make sofa beds, too? I didn't see any." Such a thing would be useful at Twilight's place, now that the other had vanished overnight. He still didn't understand that. The shopkeeper stared at him. "Sofa beds?" "Yeah," said Harry. "You know, a sofa that folds out into a bed. They're great for unexpected guests or small rooms." "Folds out," said the proprietor as he sat on his haunches. Harry frowned. "Have you ever heard of a futon? That's the simplest one." The stallion shook his head. Harry stepped outside and started to draw angled lines in the dirt beside the porch. "These wooden pieces are the back of the futon, about a hoof apart. They attach to these horizontal pieces with a rod through their ends as a hinge. He drew some horizontal lines interspaced with the bottoms of the angled ones. The frame holds them up. He sketched a couple of other lines. The important part is here at the sides where the hinge meets the frame. He pointed with a forehoof. It slides back and forth and lets the seat slide forward and the back to slide forward while dropping level. He stepped over and drew another sketch of a bed where the former sofa arms were now a very short headboard and tailboard at each end of a flat-ribbed bed. The mattress on it is just a giant cushion that folds and doubles as the seat and back when it's a sofa. He grinned up at the pony. The back moving forward means it can be close to a wall and still fold into a bed without having to move it. No wasted space that way. There's another kind, usually with a metal frame, that fits inside a normal sofa. It folds into thirds where 1/3 slides up behind the back and the other 2/3 fold together and fit under the seat cushions. It usually has a thin mattress that folds away with the bed part. Most people can't tell it's a bed until you unfold it. Harry finished. That was what the Dursleys had in the sitting room, not that they ever used it. The fillies were staring at him, as was the shopkeeper. "That's brilliant," the pony whispered. "Show me." He hustled them back inside, stopping to put a closed sign on the door. Harry winced as he heard another crash from the storage room. "I'm all right," came Apple Bloom's voice. He looked around the workshop and shuddered. Feathers covered the entire floor like a multicolored field of snow. Muffled sounds from the sewing table, and the 2 hooves sticking out of opposite corners of a lumpy cushion revealed that Sweetie Belle had managed to sew herself inside it with the sewing machine and was currently trying to escape. And Scootaloo. Scootaloo looked to be building a large ballista out of scrap wood, metal braces, and cloth. The back room was in a shambles, but the shopkeeper didn't seem to care. He hadn't even flinched at the latest crash. He stared at the working tabletop models of a futon and a sofa bed, gently converting them from couch to bed and back, repeatedly. "These are brilliant," he whispered. He looked at Harry. "You have revolutionized the sofa industry, my colt." Harry blushed. "But back where I used to live everyone knows about these things, so they aren't my idea." The pony stared at him steadily. "But in all of Equestria, no one else has ever seen or thought of these. I thank you for bringing them to me." He blinked and looked around his workroom. "Oh, dear," he said, surprised at what he saw. Sweetie Belle had managed to get her head out of the cushion and was looking around before embarking on getting the rest of the way out. There was a yelp from Scootaloo as her project tipped over and disintegrated with a bang, and a loud thunk from across the room. The numerous pieces went skittering across the floor. Apple Bloom came out of the storeroom, checking to see what the noise was. A sliding sound and thud of something heavy hitting the floor behind her followed her out. Sweetie Belle looked up at the thin wooden rod, that hadn't been there a minute ago, now protruding from the wall a few inches over her head. Harry sighed. "I think we should head home now, girls, it's almost dinner time." Scootaloo tried to look innocent as she nonchalantly stepped away from the remains of her afternoon's activity. Yeah, I think you're right, Harry." "Oh, yeah," said Apple Bloom, looking out the new rough-edged window between the workroom and the shop's front display room. The long shadows visible through the outside windows clearly indicated the lateness of the hour. "A little help, here," said Sweetie Belle testily, flopping onto the floor with a thud and an ow. Davenport sighed sadly. "I'm sorry," said Harry, "I should have kept a closer watch on them." He looked up at the stallion worriedly. The pony gave him a half-hearted smile as he surveyed the wreckage that remained of his nice and neat workroom. "That's all right," he said, his tone faltering. He took a deep breath and looked at his 2 tabletop models. His smile became a bit more genuine. "I think, all in all, it's a more than fair trade." "This is a great idea, Harry," Sweetie Belle said. "Cutie Mark Crusader Honey Harvesters." Why, they all cried out. It was the day after their foray into sofa making and not too long after school let out. They stood beside an old, lightning-struck tree across the path from Sweet Apple Acres. One side and the canopy above were covered in the green leaves of a healthy tree, while a large section just below the lowest branch was the weathered light brown of dead wood. Bees flew in and out of a large opening in that section. Now, the book I read in the library, Harry explained, said we should use a smoky torch to soothe the bees before we try to get any honeycombs out. He held up a wooden stick wrapped in rags. So, we need to wait a few minutes before doing anything. Is everything set? He looked over to Scootaloo's scooter and cart. The cart held a small barrel that could hold about 10 gallons of liquid. It was an old cider cask that they had borrowed for this. Applejack wouldn't mind once they brought it back full of honey. Nodding, he concentrated, and soon a small flame appeared on the rags. As soon as it was going, he lifted the torch in his magic and held it in front of the opening. The old oily rags performed as they should, and smoke enveloped that section of the tree. For about 1 minute, then the rags fell off the stick and burnt to ash slightly before or after they hit the ground. This left Harry holding up a stick with a slightly charred tip. The bees did not seem all that soothed either. "Well, DMN," said Harry, dropping the stick. They stared at the stick for a moment. "How about we start a fire here and put green leaves on it to make smoke," suggested Apple Bloom. "That's what my sister does when dealing with a wasp's nest in the barn." Soon they had a respectable little fire going about 10 feet from the tree. The leaves, when added, made a nice thick white smoke that the wind then blew straight over the hole in the tree. "Yay!" cheered Scootaloo. Then the wind changed direction to the left, making the smoke miss the tree to the right. "Ah," they all said. But they added some wood to the left of their fire, added more leaves, and soon the smoke was once more enveloping the beehive entrance. Until the wind shifted again. Soon, they had a smoldering ring of fire around the tree with a plume of smoke that covered the right spot no matter what the wind's direction was. After 10 minutes, they kicked a hole through the ring, downwind of the beehive entrance, and went closer, bringing the barrel with them. Apple Bloom planted her hooves firmly. Sweetie Belle climbed onto Apple Bloom's back. Then Scootaloo flew onto Sweetie Belle's back. And Harry finally climbed up to the top. From his new vantage point, he could easily see into the hive and used his levitation magic to separate and lift out a honeycomb. Sweetie Belle gently swept the comb with her magic, shooing the bees off, and leaving the honey. Harry carefully kept the honey from dripping off as he lowered the comb into the small barrel. They did this until Sweetie Belle called out, "That's it. The barrel is full." "Ah," said Harry, "there's plenty left inside, I can feel it with my magic." "Well," Apple Bloom interjected, "we want to make sure the hive has plenty for the winter." Harry, Sweetie Belle, and Scootaloo jumped down and started to kick dirt over the smoldering ring of fire. After she put a lid on the barrel, Apple Bloom joined them. Harry and Scootaloo went one direction while the other two fillies went the other direction. The unicorns pulled the fire apart while their partners kicked dirt over it to put it out. It was only when they reached the section closest to the forest that they discovered a flaw in their afternoon's plan. "Oops," said Harry, staring at the line of fire leading into the forest and rapidly spreading on the dead branches and dry debris liberally littering the forest floor. "I think maybe a dead branch was under that part of ARR smoke ring," said Apple Bloom. They watched as the fire spread to the base of a fourth tree. "I once heard a telly show," Harry said, "that said fires are an important part of keeping a forest healthy. That they burn the debris of broken branches, leaves, and fallen trees and restore nutrients to the soil. That the fire creates more open spaces for new trees by burning up dead or diseased trees. And that there are even some trees whose seeds won't start growing until after a fire passes through. And that unless there's a drought, the healthy trees easily survive. The nearest tree's leaves suddenly went up in flames, the tree turning into a giant torch, the heat triggering a second tree into becoming fully involved in flames. The fillies didn't say anything, mesmerized. "I think I need to tell my sister about this," said Apple Bloom nervously. "And maybe the guards," suggested Sweetie Belle in an equally unsteady voice. They slowly started backing to the honey barrel, intending to grab it and run. "Definitely the fire brigade," said Harry. Apparently, some of the roots of the bee tree had also been close to the surface at their fire ring. As a result, those now charcoaled roots were no longer doing their job. There was a loud crack and the tree began to tilt, the dead section beginning to split and honey pouring out. "Run!" yelled Harry. Before they could take more than a few steps, though, the dead section of the tree fell to the ground with a huge thump. It landed right on their barrel, crushing it and splashing them liberally with a mixture of sap and honey. The bees were enraged, and headed for the 4 foals. Scootaloo hopped on her scooter and started towards the apple farmhouse, the other 3 right on her tail. She hadn't gone 5 feet before Apple Bloom passed her at a dead run. "I am so grounded," they heard her mmm as she quickly took the lead. Harry, behind the others, shouted, "I'll head for the town hall." "Sweetie Belle, head for the fire department." "Scootaloo, get Twilight." Apple Bloom was already headed for the farmhouse to warn her family. The other 3 took off in slightly different directions at a full gallop. Harry didn't notice the queen bee clinging to his mane. Nor the swarm that followed him, and only him. "Dear Celestia, I tried your suggestion of grounding Harry. See updated notes on the Everfree forest fire and subsequent bee infestation of the town hall by restricting him to the library and letting him read only his textbooks. It didn't work. He thanked me for the additional time he could practice his magic without being interrupted. Apparently the cutie mark crusaders were distracting him a bit from his magical studies, in his opinion. Any other suggestions? Your faithful student, Twilight Sparkle." So alright folks, that's all for today. Stay tuned for part 5. Do subscribe, like and share for more such videos. Also check out the story and author tkepner on fanfiction.net. Press the bell icon to be notified first on release. See you in the next video. Till then, goodbye.